on Afghanistan by Ambassador Blackwood. Before we proceed any further, could I request you all switch off the mobiles, place them on silent, speak, whatever you prefer, so that we can carry through the next hour without any phones ringing. The subject, of course, is quite fascinating, and Ambassador Blackwood has written quite a bit about it. But before we get into the subject, I will say a few words about the Aspen Institute. Recently founded in India, the Aspen Institute hopes to continue with the great Aspen traditions of reflecting on the enduring humanistic values, promoting frank, open, calm debates on contemporary issues, and to take steps to promote enlightened leadership among the civil society. So it is with this framework, the Aspen, you would have seen in the last few weeks, has been taking more activities, and we hope to be here, more programs from the Aspen Institute India. In terms of introducing Ambassador Blackwood, as I say in Delhi, I think most of you know him, so I'm not going to go into a long introduction. As you all know, that he served as ambassador in India between 2001 and 2003. After that, he went back to the US. He was a Deputy National Security Advisor to President Bush. He was part of his campaign team in 2004 presidential elections as a major advisor on foreign policy to him. Right now, Ambassador Blackwood is with the Council on Foreign Relations. Now, I think those of you who know him in Delhi, I think his contribution to building the US-India relationship was based on the conviction and the strength to challenge the conventional wisdom about India in motion. That requires a lot of guts and a lot of persistence to force a fundamental rethink about how the US should organize its relationship with India. I think Ambassador Blackwood brings the same qualities of critical thinking, the ability to challenge conventional wisdom, and the capacity to articulate controversial ideas. He brings the same ideas today to dealing with the current situation in Afghanistan. Those of you who are following the US debates after the WikiLeaks and now Bob Woodward spoke, it's quite clear there is, shall we say, turbulence in Washington in terms of what the American strategy towards Afghanistan should be. For us, I think it's important to remember the choice, even in this current confused debate in Washington, is not about staying or leaving. That there are many options in between. That is, a readjusted American strategy is on the cards, and that readjusted strategy most probably would involve significant downward adjustment of the size of the American military presence in Afghanistan. And that once we see that clearly, then there are a range of options that are available for the US President and the US political system. And Ambassador Blackwood has, in the recent weeks, written about one of those options that are in between staying and leaving, and I won't go into what exactly his argument is that he's going to speak. So he's going to speak for about 25 minutes, then we'll open up for questions, and then we'll try and bring this to a close sharp at 1 o'clock. Ambassador Blackwood.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Pleasure to be here with Aspen, India, and see so many old friends who are in the audience. I want, if I might, to give an epigrammatic version of my argument about a plan B for Afghanistan. So we'll have a chance to talk about it, and I'll want to hear your views about it. So forgive me in that respect. Let me begin by addressing the current strategy, the counterinsurgency strategy India's supreme strategist comes through the door as I mentioned the word strategy. Let me mention why I think, at the very outset, why the current strategy, the counterinsurgency strategy, COIN, as it's acronymically described, is going to fail. And once I've made a very brief analysis of that, then the question arises, well, if that turns out to be right, what to do then? What's the plan B? So let me tell you why I think it's going to fail. And again, I'll just do a sentence on each, although one could discuss each of these elements at length. In my judgment, all the pillars of the counterinsurgency strategy, as described in General McChrystal's document on the subject, 26,000 words, all the pillars are crumbling. None of them looks stable. So let me go through what they are. First, the United States and its allies do not have enough combat forces even to operate effectively in southeastern Afghanistan. They can seize, sometimes they can hold, but that's about it. And in many places, the holding is only as long as there is daylight. But at the night, the Taliban then gains supremacy. So one, not enough forces. Two, COIN is based, as you know, on protecting the population and winning, to use that old Vietnam cliche, the hearts and minds of, in this case, the Pashtun. I believe that the forces who are meant to do this, and this is primarily a military mission, the American and other forces, although mostly American, are too ignorant of local history, of the language, of the tribal structures, of the politics and the values of the Pashtun to accomplish this social engineering and shift Pashtun loyalties to the Allied and Kabul government side. Third, the quality of governance emanating from the Karzai government is deeply corrupt, systemically corrupt, and is unlikely to improve. We saw this, of course, in the latest September 18 parliamentary elections. It is often said that, and I believe accurately, that in Afghanistan writ large and in Pashtun Afghanistan, most Afghans don't like the Taliban. I believe the polling shows that to be the case. At least in the United States, what's not added is they also detest the Karzai government. So they don't like the Karzai government any more than they like the Taliban. Next, the Afghan National Army will not be able to hold its own with the Taliban on any reasonable timeline. The U.S. Marine Corps commander was quoted just about 2 weeks ago that he didn't think that the Afghan National Army would be able to take over security from U.S. troops in Helmand and Kandahar provinces for at least 5 years, at the earliest. At the earliest. So you know, those of you who follow this closely, you have seize, hold, build, transfer. But the transfer part looks extremely difficult and a very long timeline. So that pillar doesn't look promising. Then there's the issue of Pakistan sanctuaries for the Afghan Taliban. And my own judgment is, we can talk about this in our conversation, that that's not going to change. That General Kayani and his senior colleagues will continue to provide those sanctuaries to the Afghan Taliban, and that they will continue to support their longtime friends in the Afghan Taliban. And finally, I think COIN will fail because the timelines in Afghanistan for success, if success could ever be accomplished, are far longer than domestic American politics will permit. So, if I'm right, and COIN is likely to fail, what is the best plan B? Okay? Now, let me give you my plan B, but I urge you to have a better plan B, because I'm not proprietary about the notion of protecting American and Indian equities regarding Afghanistan. Well, my plan B is this, that the United States should stop talking about exit strategies from Afghanistan. As Henry Kissinger observes, when Americans talk about exit strategies, they talk most about exit and very little about strategies. So I think we should stop talking in that way and instead commit the United States to a long-term combat role in Afghanistan of around 40,000 to 50,000 troops over many years to come. At the same time, Washington would accept that the Taliban will inevitably control most of the Pashtun homeland in the south and east of the country, and that the American price for preventing that is too high. And that price today, of course, is about $100 billion a year, $2 billion a week, and somewhere between 700 and 1,000 dead Americans a year, and that price, in my judgment, is too high. So, commit to a long-term military presence, but accept the Taliban are likely to control the homeland. Okay? Now, I don't want for a second to say this is an ideal outcome to the 10-year American commitment in Afghanistan. In fact, it's deeply disappointing given that commitment and the blood and treasure that we've already expended. But I believe myself that it is the best result that Washington can now realistically and responsibly achieve. Now, we would say under my plan B to the Taliban that we accept that they're going to control their homeland, the Pashtun South and East homeland. We don't like it, but we're no longer going to fight and die there to prevent it. But that if they encroach on the rest of Afghanistan, or if they invite al-Qaeda back into Afghanistan, we would use air power special forces to target them and any al-Qaeda based in Afghanistan, or al-Qaeda across the border in Pakistan. I would expect the Afghan Taliban to challenge that equation, and then the United States would act as I said. Now, what are the advantages of this proposition? And then what are the disadvantages of it? Because it is only in Harvard classrooms are there perfect public policy prescriptions. So what are the advantages and what are the disadvantages? Well, the advantages, it seems to me, is first that this Plan B would make clear to all regional states and beyond that the United States, through its prolonged military presence in Afghanistan, intended to remain a power and influence in South and Central Asia for many years to come. So that's point one. It would dramatically reduce American military casualties. As you know, almost all our casualties are in the South and the East, and therefore minimize U.S. domestic political pressure for a hasty American withdrawal from Afghanistan. It would substantially lower the American budget-breaking expenditures regarding Afghanistan, as I said, $100 billion a year. It would allow the American Army and Marine Corps to recover from a decade of fighting 2 ground wars. It would increase the likelihood that our NATO allies would stay longer because they would be taking fewer casualties. And it would, and this is an important point, if controversial, it would reduce Pakistan's capacity to use the American ground role in southern Afghanistan to extract tolerance from Washington regarding terrorism against India emanating from Pakistan. And finally, my Plan B would allow the administration in Washington to concentrate more intensively on 4 issues that I think are far more important, at least to the United States, than Afghanistan and its future. And those 4 are the cataclysmic dangers of nuclear terrorism, the rise of Chinese power, the Iranian nuclear program, and the future of Iraq, all of which I think are more important than Afghanistan. Now, there are some other plans out there, and I will now briefly just describe them. The first one is stick with Plan A, which is the current strategy. Give it time to work, and it will. So this is, and let me say here, consistent with Aspen India's culture, that decent people can disagree about this. Fair-minded folks can have different views of this, and some of my best friends, in fact, in Washington, have the view I'm about to describe, which is stay the course. However, here is my problem with that idea. According to the CIA, in Afghanistan today, there are between 50 and 100 al-Qaeda fighters. 50 and 100. Incidentally, that's about $1 billion per fighter, if you think about it like that, or 1,000 American troops for each al-Qaeda fighter, if you think about it like that. And I think it's far beyond any reasonable expenditure given the numbers. And just to remind, the original U.S. military objective in Afghanistan was to destroy al-Qaeda, not to fight the Afghan Taliban. And we have largely destroyed al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. So we've largely accomplished our original mission that we've been pursuing all these years. So that's Plan A. What I might call Plan C is withdraw all American, and that would mean all foreign, military forces from Afghanistan quickly, over the next year or 2. Well, I could go into this in detail, but I think this would be a disaster for the United States and for the region. The Taliban, I think, would fairly quickly reconquer all of Afghanistan, that there would be a civil war in that country, and it would be reflected as a major strategic defeat for the United States, give a tremendous boost to jihadism everywhere, and so forth. But certainly that Plan C is now part of the American debate, and serious Americans support it. Then the third, which is a kind of amalgam of AA and this one, is negotiate with the Taliban to provide long-term stability in Afghanistan. Well, the problem with that one, and by the way, I don't myself oppose negotiating with the Taliban, but I think there's virtually no chance for success. As Leon Panetta, the head of the American CIA, says, why would they negotiate seriously when they think they are winning? And then he goes on to say, we have no evidence that they are willing to negotiate frankly, and because they're convinced that the United States is going to be defeated and going to withdraw. Okay, so now so those are the ideas out there in the American debate. Let me now, in my final comments, address what are reasonable questions, if not criticisms, of my Plan B, and let me just go through them. The first is that if the Taliban controlled the homeland, the Pashtun homeland, it would invite a flood of al-Qaeda fighters to join it in that homeland, putting the United States back into a pre-9/11 situation. Now, at least to me, it's not self-evident that this would happen. Perhaps the Afghan Taliban learned something the first time around when we overthrew them because of their unwillingness to separate themselves from al-Qaeda. But even if they were to invite the al-Qaeda fighters in Pakistan over the line, how much difference would that make? There are about, again, according to the CIA's public testimony, about 300 al-Qaeda fighters in Afghanistan along that border. 50 to 100 on the Afghan side, 300 or so on the Pakistan side. And my question is it worth $100 billion and 7 to 1,000 American deaths a year to keep these guys on one side of that line in the mountains rather than on the other side of that line in the mountains, especially when we would, of course, through our drones, our predators, our standoff weapons, be trying to kill them on both sides. And there's a further point, which is if the Taliban the Afghan Taliban invited al-Qaeda back in a big way, of course, we would then be attacking the Taliban political infrastructure in their homeland. And therefore, the sky would be dark with predators, and they, if they wish to administer their homeland, would either have to do it from caves, where they essentially are now, or at least changing beds every night, or they would be vulnerable if they were mayors, governors, tax collectors, police chiefs, and so forth, to standoff weapons attack by the United States. So I think myself that the possibility is certainly there that those al-Qaeda fighters would come across that line, but I don't believe it's worth an indefinite American war in southeast Afghanistan to prevent it. One last thing about the 9/11 analogy. Of course, before 9/11, the United States for almost a decade watched the al-Qaeda and /Taliban forces build up their infrastructure inside Afghanistan. Passively, we watched it. We would not be passively watching it, I can tell you at this time. All right, so anyway, that's one issue. Another is well, the Taliban would not accept any such de facto partition and would seek to conquer the whole country. That might be true, but I think if we had the American forces that I described, as well as hopefully a growing capacity of the Afghan army, I believe we could prevent that from happening. Another criticism is, well, you would be leaving the non-Pashtun who live in the homeland, the Pashtun homeland, and the Pashtun tribal forces who wish not to join the Taliban in the hands of the Taliban. Well, that's regrettably true. We should, of course, support from a distance the Pashtun Afghans who seek to resist the Taliban. I think we should be under no illusion that most of them will succeed. But again, if I keep returning to the how much should we pay to avoid that, and I think the price is too high. At least in the United States, another criticism of this idea is that it would subject the women of Pashtun Afghanistan to the merciless Taliban culture. And that is tragically true. And I don't avoid admitting that it's tragically true. But the United States and its partners did not go to war in Afghanistan to protect Pashtun women. And we should not take on that decades-long task now, in my opinion. Finally, or almost finally, the de facto partition would ignite a civil war. The distinguished NATO Secretary General has reacted to my plan by saying, well, this would trigger a civil war. I have to say, by the way, I have a great admiration for the NATO Secretary General, not only because he's a Dane and my wife is a Dane, but because he's a very distinguished person. But he says it would trigger a civil war. I wonder what he thinks is happening there now. If it's not a civil war, of course it's a civil war, and we have supported one side against another. But I think my own judgment is, if we leave that Plan C I described, there will be a civil war, which I think the Taliban with their ISI supporters are likely to win. But if we stay in the way I've described, I do not believe there will be a civil war, because I believe we can, and our partners can, prevent it. Then there is the issue, as I near the end, of Pashtunistan, which is, well, wouldn't your idea make an irredenist Pashtunistan more likely, and perhaps even the fracturing of the Pakistan state? And again, this is a serious issue worth deep study and reflection. But I am struck by the fact that the entity that is most today promoting Pashtunistan is the Pakistan Army, as it has been doing for the last decade in its cross-border activities into Afghanistan with the Afghan Pashtun. And as an American, I have to say, I'm not sure I should be more preoccupied with Pakistan's territorial integrity than the General Staff of the Pakistan Army. Now, it would be a major diplomatic challenge to persuade the partners, the regional states, the neighbors of Afghanistan, to enter into such a set of objectives. And of course, Iran would be a special problem for the United States, given our very bad relations with Iran, which you're aware of. But I would myself like to see our ambassador in Kabul beginning to try to talk to his Iranian counterpart. And we have in India, it seems to me, a good channel to pass our ideas to Tehran, even if we can't say so directly. Now, some people, and again, this may not be an argument. In fact, I think it is not an argument one hears so much here, but in Washington, there is a strong theme that the surge in Afghanistan will work because the surge in Iraq worked. And I just want briefly to point out that my dear friend and former U.S. envoy to Afghanistan, James Dobbins, who some of you know, has argued that the Iraq situation and the Afghan situation have almost nothing in common. I can go back through that and disaggregate it if you wish, but I think analogizing between the two is a serious mistake. So, as I conclude, salient questions keep arising, at least in my mind, regarding U.S. policy in Afghanistan currently. Will historians understand why the United States 1,000 troops into Afghanistan nearly 10 years after 9/11? Will current U.S. policymakers remember 20 years from now why they thought it was so important to defend Helmand Province and the village of Marja, and sometimes to speak as if the fate of the civilized world depended on America pacifying those areas? In 2 decades, will the top of the current administration still find the grand strategic importance of Kandahar self-evident? And if the answers to all these questions are negative, what's the best plan B? Academics and pundits can be satisfied with only criticizing current policy suggestions. That is nearly a full-time occupation by the Harvard faculty, where I was, as you know, for 14 years. But if you're a policymaker, as some of you in this distinguished audience have been, you know that if you don't like one course of action, if you're a policymaker, you have to propose another. So one of the challenges I give you today is, do you have a better plan B? And if you do, don't keep it to yourself. Because for me, the de facto partition of Afghanistan is hardly a utopian outcome there. I just think it's better, my plan B, than the other alternatives. And I will go further and conclude with this thought. I think that by the spring or early summer, Plan A will be dead in Washington, the current coin strategy. And the real debate coming in Washington will be between some version of Plan B or Plan C. In other words, between a prolonged U.S. military presence in Afghanistan at substantially reduced levels or a relatively rapid total military withdrawal. I think that's what the debate is going to be by the spring or summer. And of course, my own strong policy preference is for the United States to remain in Afghanistan militarily over the long term. So again, I apologize for the epigrammatic nature of this, but I wanted to give plenty of time to hear your comments, your questions, and so forth. So thank you, Chairman. Sorry for the
floor is open. We've got about 20-odd minutes. So I'd like people to come up with some short questions, brief comments, so that we can carry on this conversation.
What's the role for India in your plans for communication with Iran?
Well, the role for India is up to India, a shocking proposition. But I would hope that India would participate in a regional effort to stabilize the parts of Afghanistan that are not taken over by the Taliban, that is to say, the north and west of the country. One of the prescriptive suggestions I would make, which I didn't have really time, is I think that Washington should soon mount a major diplomatic effort with the partners and with the neighbors of Afghanistan. In the absence of that, the neighbors are launching their own intense diplomatic activities about the end game in Afghanistan. So I would hope India, along with others, including Iran and Russia, perhaps China, we would have to see, the Central Asian states, would all be part of this effort to prevent the Taliban from reconquering the entire country. And I believe it's fair to say that the nations I mentioned, none of them want to see the re-Talibanization of all of Afghanistan. But this would be a substantial diplomatic challenge for the United States, and it should begin now, in my opinion.
You mentioned the rise of China as a very important factor in policy making in the United States. China is strengthening its position in the POK and also in Afghanistan. Is this being factored? Is it necessary to factor it in American policies in the region?
Well, nations regarding my Plan B, but China isn't one of them. But I would certainly hope that China would be a beneficent participant in such an idea. I think that the issues you raise, which I'm also quite concerned about, and there are only two of a long list you could have mentioned about increasing Chinese aggressiveness, are essentially separate from what I'm proposing, but have to be dealt with certainly by any of the United States, Southeast Asian countries and countries that are concerned. But I don't believe, I would try to get them to participate in a positive way. And as you know, they are developing mining interests in Afghanistan. So they're gaining their own equities there. But I don't know, I haven't been to Beijing. I've been to several of these other capitals to discuss this idea. I haven't been to Beijing. I'd like to go to Beijing and talk to them about it, but I haven't yet. And then, of course, they would be best, as in all cases, to talk about their feelings about it rather than through the Blackwell megaphone. So ask them.
So, would you like to? King's ambassador.
Aha!
I'm very happy about the nice words about the Secretary General of NATO. Of course,
my wife will be thrilled that you're asking me a question. I wish you were here. Right?
I know. But coming back to your rather provocative kind of analysis, I mean, this Plan B, would that not be really just another step towards the total catastrophe in the sense that we will have full withdrawal? Reminding you that Denmark is a very close ally to you and to what is happening in Afghanistan. We have had a number of casualties, and relatively speaking, perhaps we are one of the most, let's say, severe hit countries in that context. But, I mean, the point of departure originally was a value-based, activistic foreign policy inspired by the United States, President Bush, and also taken over by Denmark. Would that not be the end of this if we are following the Plan B? Thank you.
I think it's a terrific question. First of all, I believe it is the case that the Danes have the highest casualty rate. It's in the top three behind the Americans and the British, not well known. And they are fighting and dying in the South and the East. At least so far, supported by the Danish public, which is interesting, unlike most of the other European countries. On the issue, I think it's a fair question. Well, isn't Plan B just on the way to Plan C? And I cannot guarantee that that's not the case. I can't guarantee it. It could be the case. It depends. I think it would depend first on the resolve of the American president not to go to Plan C. And second, on whether Plan B, as it began to unfold, seemed to be working. If it doesn't work, then we are headed for Plan C. for sure. I think that the chances of success are substantial, but they're not guaranteed. The second part of the question is painful for someone who still believes the legacy of the George W. Bush administration will be treated more positively by historians than certain contemporary critics. But I believe it was a mistake when we changed the mission of our intervention in Afghanistan from anti-terrorism to nation building. I just think it was a mistake, given that society and our capacity to socially engineer it. And in the north and the west of the country, I would continue to try to assist them in the development of their civil society as best one could. But my preoccupation would not be that, because as I think the evidence is in now that we're not, at least the Americans are not very good at nation building anywhere. Our record is not good anywhere, and we can't substitute for the Afghans in nation building. So I think it was a mistake to enlarge the mission as you eloquently described it, and we should get back to the central preoccupation we had after 9/11, which was to be sure that Al-Qaeda did not again flower and attack our countries.
I'm a politician. Simple question is, the moment you moved into Iraq, I think the Afghan war was lost. You say it's not acceptable to the Americans to lose 900 to 1,000 people and to lose 100 billion a year. Didn't you know these things before you moved into the war? Number two, we are huge states in your plan. The moment you say, okay, let the South and the East go to the Taliban, we are going to have huge problems on our border. So your plan, Mr. Blackwood, it's really detrimental to India's interest. It wouldn't work.
Well, whether it's in India's interest, and that's fair enough. And I won't myself tell India what to do in this regard, at least not in this setting. Express my view, and so you all can decide. What I was trying to say is that your preference, perhaps not yours, sir, but many Indians' preference, that the United States keep fighting and dying in Pashtun Afghanistan in perpetuity is not going to happen. Is not going to happen. So therefore, what instead? And I can understand that the Indian preference would be that. Fight until you've defeated the Taliban. But we've been there 10 years. That seems like a reasonable time to try to carry out the mission. So that's the first point. The second, you made an assertion, which might be true, that this would increase terrorism on your borders, and it might be true. But it's not an inevitability, as I tried to say in my presentation. Let me just point out, today, the terrorism on your border doesn't emanate from Afghanistan. It emanates from Pakistan. And if I had to guess, I'd guess that will continue to be the case, whatever happens in Afghanistan, I would guess. And finally, and I've looked into this, and it's a telling point that I'd like you to remember. To this day, the Afghan Taliban have launched no terrorist attacks against any foreign targets outside Afghanistan. Not one. And that, it seems to me, is an important factor to keep in mind as to whether that evolution toward more terrorism across your borders would actually happen. I was here when Indian politicians that I admired and still do called Pakistan the epicenter of international terrorism. Well, it was then, and it is now, and I think that is disconnected to a large degree from what happens in Afghanistan. Later, over a cup of tea.
Mr. Blackman, one of your assumptions is that the Pakistanis will be able to control
Afghanistan, or at least the Pashtun belt. What if that does not happen and the Taliban take over Pakistan? What would be the consequences of that? Secondly, I think it would make Pakistan even less inclined to do any business with India, because they would have got what they've been looking for, strategic depth. Now that may not be an American problem, but it would be an Indian problem. And I think looking ahead, since this is a chessboard, you're looking at A, B, C, it could lead to the breakup of Pakistan, because Baluchistan, if there's a de facto Pashtunistan, what happened to Baluchistan? Now, I'm not judging whether the breakup of Pakistan de facto is a good or a bad thing, but it's something that we have to look ahead.
No, I agree, and of course I spoke to that, but too briefly. Trying to disaggregate, you cleverly, I think, embedded about 5 questions in your question, but I can't probably do them all. But let me just say, and I implore you all, to some degree, and most of you are my friends, I can say this, that you all would be good Harvard faculty members, because you're not saying what you would do, you're just saying what's wrong with my plan. So, well, I invite you all to join the Harvard faculty when you have a chance. Because I think the issues that you raised and our colleague here raised are important issues, but they do come down to what instead, and if the instead is a continued American military presence in the south and the east of the country as it is now, I believe that's not in the cards. So what's a better idea? On the Taliban, I'll just do this part because it's a very rich question. On the Taliban and the Pakistan military and ISI, I don't know how strong their influence, I don't want to say control, their influence on the Taliban is, the Afghan Taliban, but they spend a lot of resources trying to increase that influence for sure. And I believe that to some degree they would have, quote, strategic debt, as you say. And the issue is for the United States, well, how much do we want to spend in blood and treasure to prevent that from happening? And I can see why an Indian strategist would say as much as necessary, because it would be better for India. But no American strategist can start, or should start, with what's best for India. Hopefully, what's best for the United States is congenial to Indian interests, and myself have spent the last 10 years in trying to make that possible. So I don't know for sure, but here would be my guess. Here's my guess. The Afghan Taliban's strategic objective is reconquering the whole country. Strategic objective. That's my judgment. One could disagree with that. The ISI's strategic objective is to continue to use the Afghan Taliban as an instrument of Pakistan's national security policy, and if that included the re-Talibanization of all of Afghanistan, I do not believe the Pakistan military would oppose it. So here would be, I would say, the choice, or a choice, either have an American total withdrawal, which, as you know, I oppose, in which case the Pakistan defense in depth would go to the Uzbek border, or confine it, through my plan B, to the area along the border with Pakistan. So I think those are the two choices. If you have a better choice, good, and let's hear it, and we can debate it. But I think those are going to likely to be the real choice. If I could wave a magic wand and persuade the Pakistan military to accept the territorial integrity and independence of Afghanistan and all the rest, well, I'd wave the wand. But I don't have such a wand.
I think we are beginning to run against
the
clock.
The questions are good and my answers are long, so the questions will remain good and I'll see if my answers are shorter. I don't have to, since we got started a little late, I don't have to go right out the door at one. So, and I think the comments are so good, I'll
So we'll
engage.
take the questions, few of them bunched together. There's a gentleman there.
Well, sir, we all are dreamers, so I have a deep plan, the dream plan. I hope you will endorse it. My plan is, Pakistan is a totally rogue state. We all have agreed that this is at the center of terrorism. So let's fracture it on the north, where this, all this area is where the Taliban take shelter. Take Pakistan as a part of this alliance, and also let America continue its presence on a reduced basis, and on that basis let us find a strategy which can work over the next 5 years. How would you like to react to that?
Well, first of all, the United States is not going to directly participate in the fracturing of Pakistan. Remember where you heard it. It might happen inevitably, but if it does, it'll be more because of the activities of the Pakistanis than any outside entity, I think. But second, it is, and one of our colleagues raised this issue, it's a very important issue, is if Pakistan begins to fracture, which could happen, the question of those nuclear weapons comes up, and there are 100 of them or so, and it's the most important issue, I would argue, for both the United States and for India, that those weapons remain in secure and safe custody. So I would be anxious about an active policy that sought the disintegration of Pakistan, because I just think it would be impossible to control, and what would happen in the end would be so uncertain that I myself, as a strategist, would not wish to take the risk. My grandfather on the Kansas farm used to say, there are some bad situations in life that one can make worse. And so that might be in that category if Pakistan fracturing began to lose control of its weapons.
Given this is Sonia Shukla, do you think that your plan would succeed without support from the immediate neighbors like Pakistan, which are unlikely to support the plan? Because if they want to get further up into the north, they're not likely to support the modernization of Afghanistan. India is unlikely to support it for several reasons. The Russians, because of the threat from narcotics, which would become even worse, Taliban will take over a whole part of Afghanistan, are unlikely to support it, as are the Iranians. How do you hope your plan will succeed in that?
Well, first of all, I agree with you that Pakistan media and government has already spoken regarding this notion that this is not has not been congenially received in Pakistan. I think it'd be fair to say. So I wouldn't expect them, for the reasons you say, to. You made a pronouncement about India. I'm not sure it's true. But we'll see. I'm not sure it's true. Here's the way, and then the rest we would have to see. I want to agree implicitly with your question. Without the cooperation of the rest of the neighbors, this won't work. And that means Iran, Russia, and India, and so forth. It won't work. So that's, in olden days, dealing with that was called diplomacy. A now archaic idea, which is practiced less and less on Mother Earth. But if I were doing it, what I would do is go to the Indians and go to the Iranians and say, with that, before pronouncing sort of the American requirements, tell us what steady state in Afghanistan that you can live with, not your ideal, that you can live with, and then see what the answer to that is and see how much overlapping there is. But you can't really know the answer to that until you talk to responsible authorities in these capitals and find out. If the answer then is, from here or wherever, sorry, we don't like your plan B, and we're not offering a plan B, then we're on our way home, we Americans. We're on our way home. Because we are not going to stay in Afghanistan, I believe, for the reasons I tried to say, in the current situation for years ahead. So that would be the role of diplomacy, and you'd see. And you might be right that the Indian government would solemnly say what you pronounced, but I'm not. I know some friends in the Indian government too, and I suppose they want to think carefully about it and say, as they do systemically, well, that's one possibility. What are others? And maybe they could find others that would protect India's interests better, and we'd see.
In Afghanistan, including the warlords, I would strongly support Plan B.
You had 30 minutes to develop those ideas.
Just two very short points which need to be elaborated upon. One is what do we do with the Pashtun pockets in Kunduz, in Baglam, in areas of Pakistan, that's one. Number two, what about minerals? Lithium, copper, oil and gas. Does the de facto boundary include most of the areas in the north?
I think, again, well, thank you for your support. Every small idea begins with one supporter, so thank you very much. I appreciate it. On the first point, that's an issue to deal with. If the Pashtun were unable to challenge across the de facto lines in an overt way, you would expect them to try to generate terrorism on the part of the Pashtuns who live elsewhere, especially in the north and the west, and the allied American, European, Australian, and so forth forces and the Afghan army would have to deal with that. But here's what I would posit, at least for your consideration, is this. As you know, Taliban influence and terrorist incidents is growing in the north and the west. And I think the reason that is happening is our misdeployment in the south and the east. And if we redeploy, I think we can deal with what you described. I don't want to say it would be easy, but I think it would be at least possible. I think our current strategy is not in that category. On the minerals, well, first of all, this is a 10 to 15-year proposition anyway regarding those minerals. And nobody knows what Afghanistan is going to look like in 15 years. Quite, as you say, quite a lot of them would be on the wrong side of that de facto line. But where are they? First of all, can they generate capital in the situation I'm describing to extract those minerals? I mean, there is this irony that the Chinese wish to use the American security umbrella to develop minerals in Afghanistan. Well, I think that's a generosity from the United States which may not be merited given Chinese behavior elsewhere. So I'm not so concerned about the minerals. I'm glad they're there in the long run because they could be a source of wealth generation for the people of Afghanistan. But in the next 5 years or so, it wouldn't figure prominently in my own calculations.
My name is Sheila Bhatt. I'm from dtech.com in India abroad. And this is when you developed this theory, Plan B, I wanted to ask you that have you considered the particular different character of Afghan nature? Because in any diplomatic theories, don't you think psychology, sociology, and history of that region and the people is more important than anything else? And so I wanted to ask you this motto. A lot of people have read your Plan B and they have said that Afghans are different. And secondly, my question is that your theory, Plan B, is going quite against pre-election President Barack Obama's speech. So how, if at all, if establishment in Washington gets closer to Plan B, then how will they sell it in the domestic market? Because President Obama is considered to be a man of values. How will he change so much? Thank you.
Questions in that intervention. So you broke the record, but maybe someone else will challenge it in a minute. Let me just do two parts of this, but I think they're both, I want to do the two central parts, which I think are both excellent questions. The first is the statement, no Afghan will ever accept this. And you hear that. Well, the Pashtun in the homeland who are supporting the Taliban will accept it. We can start with that, so it's not quite true. No Taliban would accept it. I think that many Afghans in the North and the West would like the United States to continue to fight in the South and the East, but that's not in the cards over the next 10 years. So if confronted, the rest of Afghanistan, the Tajiks, the Hazars, the Uzbeks, and so forth, with the choice between Plan B and Plan C, I think they would choose Plan B and not Plan C. Again, we have to get at the difference between entities' ideal preference and the options that are available before them. The second is U.S. domestic politics. And here's what I would say about that, not personally about President Obama, but about the challenge of an American president or an American administration. Sometimes I'm asked a very fair question, which is in the category of yours, which is, how could an American president explain to, and a Danish prime minister, and so forth, the British prime minister, explain to the loved ones of those who have already died in the South and the East, 4 years from now, we have a larger group of families we have to offer condolences to. But the politics of this, the domestic politics of this is up to America's political leadership and the American people. And I'm not in a position about our American systemic incompetence after the main battle was over in Iraq. We could talk about that a lot, but we defeated the Iraqi army, but then didn't know what to do with that country, having defeated it. So that was a surprise. I'll just do one more from that day. I guess, and I'm not sure I would say it's a surprise, but I'm enormously gratified by the evolution of the U.S.-India relationship between that day and this. And I think all of us at that day, when I couldn't have a conversation with an Indian without the word Musharraf being mentioned in a negative way in the first 15 seconds, Indian views changed, by the way, over time on General Musharraf, and criticisms of the United States that went back decades, and many of them quite fair, not all of them. I think we've come to a point now where the strategic interests of the two countries are more in line. The implementation of it remains difficult, partially because of the bureaucracies on the two sides. But I think, I don't know that I would say I'm surprised by it, but I'm enormously gratified. And a lot of Americans and a lot of Indians, some of whom are in this audience, have worked very hard at this. And I think we should all feel terrific about it, because it could be argued that the most important geopolitical event in the last decade, projected forward for 20 years, is the transformation of the U.S.-India relationship. It could be argued, and we could have a good bottle of something or other and talk about that.
Yes. Ambassador, thank you very much for your kind words of this morning, so clear, so direct at the same time. As you plan B, sorry, I come from a region that maybe some think that...
Where are you from, sir?
From Peru. I'm the Deputy Chief of Mission of Peru. But in these days, nobody can say that this is not our party. This is just one single word, and this is a very important concern to all of us. As for your plan B, have you included in some way, let's say, some kind of Pan-Islamic conference involved this factor that it's not only religious but also ideological and practical, as to get some kind of support not only from the neighborhood, geographically speaking, but mentally speaking?
Well, I think it's a good question. You would start with the neighbors. This would have to come before the UN Security Council, because there are raft of resolutions. And then, as one of our colleagues said, the Russian dimension would be quite important in that regard, and the Chinese and the Security Council. But I have a particular, perhaps one could call it a Kissingerian view of big conferences, which is you only have them after you've agreed to everything. not that you think you're going to have one and get an agreement out of them, and I think there's a lot of evidence in that regard. But reaching out to the Islamic world, beginning with the Saudis, who have had, of course, a very long role to play in Pakistan, Afghanistan, would be important. And again, this would be a big diplomatic effort, because starting with NATO and our friends there and the NATO Secretary General, who, as NATO Secretary Generals do, is at the moment stalwartly defending American policy, which is exactly what he should be doing until it changes. But then, hopefully, if it's going to change, we'll give him some warning and he won't discover it on CNN. But the main point about trying to persuade the international community to support this notion would be important. I agree with you.
The last two questions, Dr.
To you about a year ago in the Taj Hotel, and at that time, if I remember right, you strongly advocated ground forces to fight the Taliban on the ground, and you assured victory. Looking back yourself, and a year is not too long, didn't you anticipate at that time already that this might not happen, that the ground situation is different, and when did you develop your famous Plan B?
Well, thank you. We have a different recollection, you will be surprised to know, about that event. So let me tell you what I think I said, which is different than what you think I said, and we'll let the stars decide. What I said was, I believe, was the dimensions, and this was of course before the McChrystal document, that the dimensions of the problem should be tried. And you can try with the Pakistanis, and you can try with the Karzai government, and so forth. And that would include, if those dimensions were successful, the introduction of more American combat troops, not in parallel with them, I believe I said. And so my proposition was, if you can get the Pakistan military to end the sanctuaries, if you can improve the quality of governance, then of course you have the platform on which to start to try to make military progress. But since those pillars never eventuated, indeed, in a sense, you can make an argument, both of them are worse now than they were then. On the second half, which is the light bulb goes off, I'll tell, and if you're interested in this question of, I had never, unlike some of you in the audience, I'd never been in a war before until I was the presidential envoy to Iraq, in which you do sit with people at breakfast and they're not alive at dinner. And that vivified for me in a way that doesn't through just reading history, and I said my military friends here know this in their DNA, that I became more and more preoccupied with the loss of American allied lives in this endeavor and the odds of success. The odds of success. And I think that for me, if you were to tell me the odds of success are 5 and 8, or 3 and 4 of the coin strategy, I might say, well, this is tragic for the families involved, but it's worth the sacrifice. But in my judgment, the odds for success are so low, that I could not, in good conscience, continue to support or support the concept. And then I thought, well, what instead? And I didn't have time, but we could do it on another occasion. I just think the strategic implications for the United States, for India, for the region of a total military withdrawal would last for decades, I believe.
The last question,
Mr. Blackwell, I wondered if you'd care to share with us what sort of reactions you would have to your very persuasively argued Plan B among policymakers in Washington.
Well, to chant Plan B, Plan B, Plan B. And let me, again, having been at the White House so many times, and I don't want to now offend my media friends in the audience and get bad stories on this appearance, but here's the problem with the administration. The Woodward book, which we've all started reading, I guess, at least in its excerpt form in the Washington Post, and it's just arrived on my Kindle, and I'll be reading it on my way back to Los Angeles. makes clear, unsurprisingly, that there was a lot of disagreement and turbulence inside the administration before they came to the president decided to increase the force by 30,000 and to strongly support General McChrystal's coin approach. They can't back away from that in any informal way, or it'll destroy any possibility that it's going to work. And if they, for example, if the person who's now in my old job were to say, well, the news from the battlefield is not so good, we better start thinking about cure. So if they're talking about it, they're talking about it in very small groups in very isolated rooms. But I would say this, so I don't want to characterize the reaction, but I would say this. I think, and I turn out to be wrong, I think that events on the ground in Afghanistan and American domestic politics and the behavior of the neighbors are going to drive the United States at some point, perhaps in the spring, perhaps to a reconsideration of the current policy. And then I think my ideas and others will be part of the public debate. The advantage we all have, since we're not in government now, or at least most of us, is that we can talk about this and nobody will pay much attention to us. But we can think our way through ourselves in a distinguished group like this about what a plan B might be in a way that governments can't. And that's the reason I was the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm now the Henry A. Kissinger Senior Fellow for American Foreign Policy at the Council. I gave a presentation on this subject to the Council for about 100 people a week ago. I gave one at the ISS in London. And I'm just trying to stimulate the debate. I'm happy if others come up with a better plan B. I'm happy. I'm even happy if people say, well, I thought our way through it and I think it's going to succeed. We'll see. But what I think groups like this shouldn't do is say, well, like governments with their constraints, we're just going to wait until the avalanche falls and then we're going to try to figure out where we might proceed then. So that's the reason I so much appreciate your comments and questions, every single one of which I think were central to this issue, every single one of them. So I think it shows again the convening power of this organization. And I just invite you to keep thinking about it. And I'm going to keep thinking about it. And this is not, my plan B is not the code of